Why are Black people still Christian in modern America? Why does Christianity continue to hold such a fierce and unyielding grip on Black America? How is it that, despite centuries of slavery, oppression, and systemic violence, so often justified and sustained by Christian institutions, millions of Black Americans still bow their heads in prayer beneath the cross? This paradox is not merely historical, it is existential. It forces us to wrestle with the deepest contradictions of human survival, where faith is both a shackle and a sanctuary, both an inheritance of pain and a source of unbreakable resilience. To confront this reality is to step into the uneasy space between liberation and control, between defiance and submission, between the desperate need to endure and the longing to be free. Christianity in this context is not simply a religion. It is a legacy stitched into the fabric of Black existence in America, a tapestry woven with both chains and hymns, both wounds and weapons. To ask why Black people are still Christian is not to mock belief, but to illuminate the weight of history and the burden of memory, to question how a community carries the very thing that once crushed it and yet also sustained it. And so, as we open this conversation, I invite you to reflect, to question, and to engage. If these words move you, challenge you, or stir something within you, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. Your voice adds to the dialogue, and together we can confront these truths with the seriousness they demand. From chains to churches, how slavery forged Black Christianity. Christianity did not enter the lives of enslaved Africans in America as a gift. It was not delivered as a gentle offering of spiritual comfort, nor as a benevolent path to salvation. It arrived as a tool of domination, wielded by slaveholders who saw Scripture as justification for bondage. The Bible was weaponized. Verses of obedience, silence, and submission were recited in plantation pulpits, all to break the spirit of an enslaved people who had been uprooted from their homelands, their languages silenced, and their gods declared false. And yet, in one of history's deepest paradoxes, the very faith that was used to justify chains became, within Black hands, a source of fire and survival. What was meant as a cage became, in some measure, a key. The enslaved did not passively absorb Christianity as it was preached from the master's pulpit. They remixed it. They reimagined it. They seized upon the whispered promises of liberation woven into the gospel. The Exodus story of Moses leading Israel out of bondage, the crucified Christ who suffered with the oppressed, the hope of justice against tyrants. In the hush of midnight gatherings, often in hidden brush, arbors away from the eyes of white overseers, the enslaved remade Christianity into something profoundly their own. It became a theology of survival and coded resistance. Spirituals carried double meanings. Songs like Go Down Moses were not only prayers but subversive cries, reminders that God could deliver them from Pharaoh just as surely as he delivered Israel. The slaveholders' religion said, "Obey your master." The enslaved people's Christianity whispered, "You will not be slaves forever." This transformation reveals the astonishing adaptability of human spirit under conditions of terror. Christianity, as it emerged among enslaved Africans, was not only about heaven, but about endurance on earth. It was a way to stitch dignity back into bodies stripped of autonomy. It offered a language to speak of pain, to imagine justice, and to keep hope alive across generations when reality provided none. But this inheritance also carried its contradictions. For while Christianity gave enslaved people spiritual tools for survival, it also tied them to the very system that dehumanized them. The Bible that inspired Harriet Tubman to hear God's call to liberation was the same Bible that plantation preachers used to crush rebellion. This duality, faith as both weapon and refuge, is the DNA of Black Christianity. And that DNA still pulses in the veins of Black America today. To understand why so many Black people are still Christian, one must return to this origin point. It was not simply belief, it was necessity. Christianity became the architecture of survival, the one structure that enslaved Africans could reshape without permission. It was a way to take the master's religion and bend it into something that could sustain a stolen people. It was both submission and defiance, a paradox etched into the heart of a community that learned to pray for freedom with the same scriptures used to justify their chains. This raises the first uncomfortable truth. Black Christianity was born out of captivity. To speak of Black faith in America is to speak of a legacy that begins not in freedom, but in enslavement. This does not invalidate its power, but it complicates its purity. It means that Christianity in Black America cannot be separated from the history of domination that forced it upon people who once had their own gods, their own sacred rituals, their own cosmologies, all stripped away by the violence of colonialism. And yet, what survived was not mere mimicry of white religion. What survived was a testimony to resilience. Black Christianity became a mirror of paradox. It was at once the evidence of oppression and the evidence of survival. That paradox is what still lingers today. In modern America, when Black people fill pews on Sunday mornings, when gospel choirs shake the walls with sound, when sermons thunder about justice, they are not merely participating in a European faith. They are carrying forward a centuries-old act of resistance, the act of turning a tool of oppression into a source of endurance. But the question remains, does this act of survival still serve liberation in the 21st century? Or does it at times chain Black identity to an inheritance that was never freely chosen in the first place? The legacy of chains and churches is not easily untangled. To be Christian as a Black American is to inherit both the memory of the lash and the hope of deliverance. It is to live in the tension between faith as lifeline and faith as control. It is to sit in a church that is both sanctuary and reminder of slavery's shadow. And it is to ask, generation after generation, whether the fire of resistance still burns in the pulpit or whether the pulpit has become another tool of conformity. This is why the question, why are Black people still Christian, is not cynical. It is historical. It is spiritual. It is philosophical. It demands that we recognize how Christianity in Black America is inseparable from the chains that forged it and from the survival that transformed it. The Black church's resistance, why leaving feels like betrayal. If slavery forged the paradox of Black Christianity, then emancipation and the years that followed deepened its role as something greater than religion. The Black church did not remain merely a sanctuary for worship. It became the very heart of Black community life, the one institution where dignity could be asserted in a world determined to strip it away. To understand why Christianity still holds sway in Black America, one must understand how the Black church evolved into the central pillar of survival, resistance, and identity. To walk away from it, even today, can feel less like leaving a faith and more like betraying a people. After the Civil War, freedom was not freedom in its fullness. Black Americans were released from bondage only to face Jim Crow laws, lynchings, economic exclusion, and political disenfranchisement. The plantation was replaced by the sharecropper's field. The whip gave way to chain gangs. The slave patrol morphed into police. In such a hostile landscape, the Black church became one of the only safe havens where autonomy could be practiced. It was in the church that Black people could elect their own leaders, craft their own rituals, and speak their own truths without white oversight. The church was more than a place of prayer. It was a parliament, a school, a cultural center, and a refuge from the violence of the outside world. While white society denied Black humanity, the church affirmed it. In the pulpit, the preacher was not a subordinate to a white master, but a leader of his people. In the choir, voices rose not as background noise to white rituals, but as the thunderous proclamation of a distinct Black identity. This transformation is crucial. Christianity, once forced upon enslaved Africans, was re-engineered into the institutional backbone of Black resistance. It was in Black churches that strategies for abolition were planned, that networks for escape were hidden, and later that movements for civil rights were born. Without the church, there would be no Martin Luther King Jr., no Southern Christian Leadership Conference, no mass meetings that fueled the fire of protest. The church was where the spiritual met the political, where the gospel of Jesus was braided with the demand for justice. And so, for generations, to be Christian in Black America was not simply about personal salvation. It was about collective survival. It was about participating in the only institution that had the power to shield, empower, and mobilize the community. Christianity was not merely belief, it was belonging. This history explains why leaving Christianity today can feel so loaded. To walk away from the church is not just to reject a faith, it can be perceived as rejecting an inheritance of struggle and survival. For many, leaving the Black church feels like abandoning the very institution that carried their ancestors through slavery, Jim Crow, and the fires of civil rights battles. It feels like severing ties with the one space that insisted on Black dignity when every other institution denied it. But this inheritance is double-edged. The weight of expectation can become suffocating. For those who question or leave Christianity, there is often a deep sense of alienation, not just from faith, but from family, culture, and identity. The Black church is not simply a building. It is weddings and funerals, baptisms and revivals, Sunday dinners and gospel songs that stretch across generations. To reject the church can feel like rejecting one's grandmother's prayers, one's father's sermons, one's ancestors' survival. This is why leaving does not feel like simple choice. It feels like betrayal. And yet this loyalty is not always about faith itself. Sometimes it is about cultural memory. The pews hold more than worshipers. They hold the ghosts of ancestors who survived because the church gave them structure, meaning, and endurance. For many Black Christians, to leave is to silence those voices, to dishonor that endurance. The decision is not only theological, it is historical, emotional, and communal. This paradox of loyalty reveals something larger. Christianity in Black America is not only religion, but heritage. It is stitched into music, language, art, and politics. From the cadences of Black preaching to the rhythms of gospel choirs that later gave birth to blues, jazz, and hip-hop, the influence of the church saturates the culture. To question Christianity is therefore to question not just faith, but identity. But herein lies the philosophical dilemma. If the church was born as a response to oppression, what happens when that oppression changes form? Does the church remain the liberating force it once was, or does it risk becoming a relic, a binding tie that prevents new forms of freedom? For some, the Black church still embodies resistance. It remains the loudest voice against systemic racism, police brutality, and economic inequality. For others, it has grown too comfortable, too wedded to respectability, too reluctant to confront new struggles such as gender justice, queer identity, or liberation beyond the traditional frameworks. This is why the question of leaving or staying is so charged. To stay may mean honoring tradition, but also tolerating its limits. To leave may mean seeking freedom, but also severing ties to a cultural lifeline. Either way, the weight of history bears down on every decision. Thus, the second uncomfortable truth emerges. Christianity persists in Black America not only because of personal faith, but because of collective inheritance. The church has been so deeply woven into the survival of the community that to reject it can feel like rejecting one's people. It is not simply about God, it is about belonging. It is about memory. It is about being tethered to the past even as one questions the future. The Black church remains therefore both sanctuary and chain. It offers comfort but also expectation. It provides community but can demand conformity. It has been the site of resistance but also the source of silence for those whose struggles do not fit neatly into its vision of justice. To ask why Black people are still Christian is, in part, to acknowledge that leaving Christianity is not merely theological rebellion, it is cultural rupture. And for many, that rupture feels like too heavy a price to pay. Faith or control, how Christianity still shapes Black identity today. If slavery was the forge in the civil rights era, the crucible, then the present is the proving ground. In modern America, Christianity is not merely the memory of chains or the echo of resistance. It is the living current that still shapes Black identity, both visibly and invisibly. The question is no longer only about how faith helped a people survive oppression. It is about how, in the 21st century, that same faith continues to define what it means to be Black in America, for better and for worse. One cannot walk into a Black church on a Sunday morning without feeling the weight of history vibrating through the air. The pulpit thunder, the call and response rhythm, the choir's soaring voices, all of it embodies the cultural inheritance of centuries. For many, Christianity remains a space where Black identity is affirmed, celebrated, and empowered. It is a place where dignity, often denied outside those walls, is restored. It is where children are taught their worth, where communities organize against injustice, where political mobilization finds its backbone. But alongside this empowerment, Christianity has also become a framework of control. The church does not merely reflect Black identity, it often polices it. Within the sanctuary, certain ways of being are uplifted as holy, while others are condemned as sinful. The same pews that nurtured resilience against white supremacy have, at times, enforced silence on issues of gender, sexuality, and individual freedom. The double-edged nature of Black Christianity, the capacity to liberate, and the tendency to constrain remains at the core of its power today. Take the Black family, for instance. In countless households, the church is still the moral compass, dictating how families are raised, how children are disciplined, how roles are performed. For some, this creates stability, a grounding force in a chaotic world. But for others, it feels like a straitjacket, enforcing hierarchies and silencing dissent in the name of tradition. The Bible that once offered hope against the master's whip is now at times invoked to demand obedience within the household, to suppress new ways of being. Politically, too, Christianity continues to shape Black life. The Black church remains a powerful organizing force, capable of mobilizing millions for justice. It was the beating heart of the civil rights movement, and even today, pastors often stand at the forefront of protests against racial injustice. But this political power also reveals the limits of church-centered identity. When Christianity is the primary lens through which Black political struggle is framed, the conversation can become restricted, unable to imagine liberation outside of the pulpit's language. Justice becomes tied to Scripture, and those who reject the faith risk being excluded from the movement itself. This tension reveals a deeper philosophical question. Does Christianity liberate Black people in modern America? Or does it bind them to an inherited script that no longer fully serves their freedom? For some, the church is still the only place where Black life is affirmed against the violence of systemic racism. For others, it is a space where new struggles around sexuality, feminism, class, and global justice are stifled in the name of biblical authority. The generational divide makes this even more apparent. Older generations, forged in the fires of segregation and civil rights, often see the church as sacred ground, the place that held their community together when the world sought to destroy it. Younger generations, however, raised in an age of internet skepticism, global perspectives, and diverse spiritualities, increasingly see the church as outdated, restrictive, even complicit in oppression. To them, the pulpit that once roared against white supremacy can sound eerily silent or even hostile on issues of gender identity, reproductive rights, or LGBTQ+ inclusion. This divide creates friction within Black identity itself. To be Black and Christian is, for many elders, inseparable. To be Black and non-Christian is, for many youth, an act of liberation from a past that feels heavy with contradictions. Yet in rejecting Christianity, they risk estrangement, not only from their families, but from the cultural heartbeat of Black America. Thus, Christianity continues to shape identity, not only through adherence, but also through rebellion. Even those who leave cannot escape its influence, for their departure is still defined in relation to the church they resist. And here lies the third uncomfortable truth. Christianity remains the framework within which Black identity is negotiated. It is both liberating and limiting, empowering and controlling. It has given the community strength to endure centuries of oppression, but it also continues to enforce boundaries on what it means to be Black, what it means to belong, what it means to be free. Philosophically, this reveals the enduring paradox of inherited faith. A religion that was never freely chosen at its origin has become the central lens through which a people understand themselves. This inheritance creates both continuity and constraint. Continuity because it ties generations together through rituals, music, and memory. Constraint because it binds identity to a framework rooted in a colonial encounter, a faith once used to enslave the very people who now embrace it. To be Black and Christian in modern America is thus to carry a double burden: to embrace the faith of survival while questioning whether it is also the faith of control. To sing gospel is to join voices with ancestors, but also to silence the ancestral gods who were erased. To sit in a pew is to be held by tradition, but also to be bound by it. To claim Christianity is to stand in a lineage of resistance, but also to carry the risk of reproducing hierarchies that silence the marginalized within. This paradox is not easily resolved. It raises questions that echo into the very core of Black identity today. Can a faith born of chains still be a path to liberation? Can a religion tied to white supremacy be fully remade into a tool of Black freedom? Or is the church, for all its beauty and resilience, still an inheritance that limits as much as it empowers? The answers are not uniform. For some, Christianity remains the heartbeat of Black resilience. For others, it is the ghost of colonial control. But either way, it is impossible to ignore. Christianity continues to shape Black identity in America, whether through faith, through resistance, or through the struggle to escape its grip. The uncomfortable truth: is Christianity still a colonial legacy? To speak of Christianity in Black America is to speak of survival, resistance, and identity, but also to confront a haunting question. Is this faith, so deeply woven into the fabric of Black life, still the shadow of colonial control? Can Christianity ever be disentangled from the history of white supremacy, or does it remain, no matter how transformed, the religion of the oppressor? This is the most uncomfortable truth of all, for it forces a reckoning with history that refuses to be softened. Christianity was not freely chosen by enslaved Africans. It was imposed, enforced, and demanded by a system that sought to annihilate their languages, their biz, their rituals, their entire cosmology. The Middle Passage was not just the theft of bodies, but of souls. To Christianize was to colonize. To baptize was to erase. This origin cannot be undone by the centuries of transformation that followed. No matter how much the faith has been remade, it carries the fingerprints of conquest. Yet this inheritance has been complicated by the genius of survival. Enslaved Africans and their descendants did not simply accept Christianity as given. They reshaped it, infused it with African rhythms, reimagined it through the lens of liberation, and made it their own. The spirituals, the sermons, the call and response traditions, all of these testify to a faith that is not merely borrowed but reborn. Black Christianity is not identical to white Christianity. It is a new creation, one that bears the scars of colonization, but also the power of reappropriation. But does this reappropriation erase its colonial roots, or does it simply mask them beneath new layers? This is where the dilemma sharpens. When a Black preacher calls upon the name of Jesus, he is invoking both the liberator of slaves and the deity imposed by colonizers. When a Black choir sings gospel, they are both resisting white supremacy and continuing a tradition birthed in forced conversion. Every hallelujah, every sermon, every prayer carries this double resonance: liberation and colonization, survival and subjugation. For some, this paradox is unbearable. They see Christianity as a lingering shackle, a sign that the colonizer's work is not yet undone. They argue that true liberation cannot come through the religion of the oppressor, that to remain Christian is to remain tethered to a colonial legacy that continues to define Black identity in foreign terms. These voices call for a return to African spiritualities, to ancestral traditions that were buried but not extinguished, to ways of knowing that predate conquest. For others, however, the transformation of Christianity into a uniquely Black tradition is itself proof of liberation. To take the oppressor's faith and bend it into a weapon of survival is, in their eyes, an act of defiance, not submission. They argue that Christianity in Black America is no longer the colonizer's religion, but a reimagined faith that carries the imprint of resilience. The question, then, is not whether Christianity is colonial, but whether Black people have succeeded in breaking its colonial chains and making it their own. This philosophical tension reverberates in modern America. On one hand, the Black church remains a place of resistance against systemic racism, a voice for justice, a sanctuary for community. On the other, it often perpetuates inherited structures of power and silence, echoing hierarchies that trace back to the colonial encounter. To remain Christian is to live within this contradiction, to embrace a faith that has both empowered and constrained, liberated and colonized. The most difficult truth may be that both perspectives are correct. Christianity in Black America is both a colonial legacy and a reimagined faith. It is both the religion of the oppressor and the lifeline of the oppressed. It cannot be neatly separated into categories of good or evil, freedom or control. It is a living paradox, one that embodies the complexity of survival itself. To acknowledge this paradox is not to belittle Black faith, but to honor its depth. It is to recognize that survival under conditions of terror requires compromise, adaptation, and creativity. Enslaved Africans did not choose Christianity freely, but they chose to make it their own. Their descendants did not inherit a pure faith, but they inherited a faith infused with the fire of resistance. This does not erase its colonial roots, but it does testify to the extraordinary resilience of a people who refuse to let oppression have the final word. And yet, the question remains for the present. Does this faith still serve liberation, or does it continue to bind? In an era of mass incarceration, police brutality, systemic inequality, and cultural erasure, is Christianity still the most powerful framework for resistance? Or does it, at times, prevent new forms of freedom by binding Black identity to a colonial inheritance? These are questions that have no easy answers. For some, the church remains a lifeline, a source of dignity and hope in a world that still denies their humanity. For others, the church has become a chain, a reminder that true liberation requires breaking free from the colonizer's faith. Both experiences are real, both perspectives valid. To ask why Black people are still Christian is therefore not to seek a single answer, but to confront a living contradiction that continues to shape Black America. The final uncomfortable truth, then, is this. Christianity in Black America is both survival and submission, both liberation and legacy of colonization. It is a story that cannot be told in simple binaries, because it is the story of a people who turn their oppressor's weapon into their own shield and yet must still carry the weight of its origins. Philosophically, this reveals something profound about human existence itself. We are never free of our origins. We inherit histories not of our choosing, and we make of them what we can. The Black embrace of Christianity is one of the most powerful examples of this human truth. To take what was forced, to remake it, to survive through it, even while questioning whether it can ever fully belong to us. So why are Black people still Christian in modern America? Because Christianity is both the wound and the balm, the chain and the key, the shadow of colonization and the light of survival. To leave it is to risk severing ties with centuries of struggle. To remain is to wrestle with its contradictions. Either way, Christianity lingers not simply as a faith, but as a legacy, a paradox, a living question that refuses resolution. And perhaps that is the ultimate answer. Black Christianity endures not because it is simple, but because it is complicated. It is the mirror of Black history itself, painful, resilient, paradoxical, alive.